Hello, welcome to this pop-up episode of Talking Politics. We're recording it whilst Presidents Trump and Zelensky and Sir Keir Starmer and a number of other European leaders are locked in talks in the White House, which could be of such massive consequence to the future of Ukraine. Mr. Zelensky's return to the Oval Office earlier passed off without incident.
It's an honor to have the President of Ukraine with us. I think there's a possibility that something could come out of it, and today's meeting is very important. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. If I can, first of all, thank you for the invitation and thank you very much for your efforts.
And after what President Zelensky described as very good talks between the two, President Trump has said it's a question of when, not if, a meeting between the US, Ukraine and Russia takes place. So things are, as you can see, moving fast. We're about an hour out from recording our News at 10 programme, which is to explain why we're in the News at 10 and not our usual podcast studio. But I have Rohit, our global security editor here, and Dan, our Washington correspondent in Washington, who has been to Alaska and back since Friday and has now watched everything play out as it has today. Dan, we always said that Donald Trump's maverick style and his habit of, some would see it, cozying up to global dictators, did have the potential to unlock something. And watching all that today, it looked like that might be possible. What was your first impression of it?
I mean, it definitely feels like a momentous day here, Tom. I don't think I've ever seen this many press camped out in the grounds of the White House behind me. I think what he has unlocked, and we'll see how significant this is this potential for Russia to accept NATO-style security guarantees. So an attack on any kind of peacekeeping force would trigger an automatic response that would be backed up by America. Now, I don't think Donald Trump is suggesting there would be American boots on the ground, but certainly there would be American backing in terms of intelligence, conceivably weaponry and air support and so on. So that's one sort of tentative step forward, but the big sort of thorny issue is still the territory that needs to be surrendered or ceded by Ukraine. And one diplomatic source we spoke to this morning said, put it like this. He said, effectively what Putin has done is sort of set a trap for Zelensky, because he has framed this as, if Ukraine gives up the rest of the Donbass, then we can move forward with a deal. Well, of course, Zelensky is going to find that very difficult to do, because that would be ceding strategically important towns like Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, which sit as a defensive ring, if you like, between the Russians and Kyiv. So he's unlikely to do that. Now, whether Zelensky has found a way to sort of navigate through that, and the other thing we were told is what needs to happen here is that Zelensky admits that there is some horse trading to be done, and maybe doesn't get pinned down on exactly what that is at this stage. But so he's not seen as being an impediment to peace, and I think that's the critical thing that they are looking to achieve today, the Europeans, that this goes smoothly, that Zelensky is not seen as a problem or a roadblock in any way, and then they'll get down to the nitty-gritty inside the White House. The other interesting thing is one of the Ukrainian delegation was seen going in with a roll of maps. So that might suggest that they are going to get down to some pretty detailed talks, not the big picture, but actually get down to sort of brass tacks of, okay, well, if you are willing to talk about ceding territory, which bits are we going to talk about?
Dan, there's so much to talk about there, and I'll come back to it in a second. But first, I just want to come to Rohit. First impression of what you saw today, and what do you think happens next?
Well, I think first impression really is actually job done for Zelensky and for the European leaders. Like, remember, the contrast here is what happened in February when Zelensky was last in the Oval Office, and he was humiliated, even down to the issue of what he was wearing. His military fatigues, the same fatigues he's worn since day one of this war in 2022. He wore the suit, and he was asked, his officials, we're told, were actually asked by people from the White House tentatively beforehand, will you be wearing a suit? And in some ways this might feel like this kind of ceremonial degradation of this war leader, who is only doing what Winston Churchill did as the leader of the UK during the Second World War. But actually there's another side to this, which is that here is a man who had learned his lessons, who was taught lessons, not just by the American delegation who mocked him in February, but actually since then by some of his allies, including Sir Keir Starmer and Jonathan Powell, the UK National Security Advisor, who've been in the background telling him what to say, not what to say, offering advice. But, he did it and he managed to get, it feels like a low bar. It really does. But he managed at first to get through 15 minutes without provoking Donald Trump. His sort of sensitivities were, like obviously a key consideration here. But they then got to that meeting, this big round table, which finished not that long ago, with all of these European leaders who indulged Trump in this kind of like avalanche of adulation, where one by one, they all told him he was fantastic. And by the way, Zelensky had done the same. As soon as he got to the White House, he shook Trump's hand and he said, thank you, 3 or 4 times. Why is that so important? Because remember, in the Oval Office earlier this year, he was told, you haven't even said thank you. So he sort of made up for what happened in February, and almost certainly he shouldn't have needed to do that. But, this is a situation that he finds himself in. So what happens next? Well, that's a more complicated bit. And actually, the German Chancellor Merz has said the path forward is more difficult than the last phase. And 2 questions there are, what happens with security guarantees, as Dan mentioned, and what happens in terms of a trilateral deal, like what everyone can agree to on the European, Ukrainian, and US side is there now needs to be either a bilateral or a trilateral meeting with Putin and Zelensky.
I want to come down to breaking it down, the security guarantees, the land swaps in a minute. But just before that, this three-way tripartite meeting, do you think it's this week, next week, 3 weeks' time? Do you think they want it now? Where do you think is it going to be in America again? What's your feeling about imminence and location?
Well, what we know is that there have been 3 locations that have been talked about. We don't know which 3 locations. I would not be surprised if one of them was in Saudi Arabia, which is where American and Ukrainian high-level delegates met a couple of months ago, just after that humiliating exchange in the Oval Office. Istanbul, the Turkish government has been putting itself up as the sort of place where these negotiations can happen. And then there's even been speculation about doing this in Rome or even in the Vatican. And, what we know, obviously, is that Trump and Zelensky met at the Pope's funeral. And
that famous shot, wasn't there? The 2 of them it was extraordinary piece of,
And what we know about the way Trump thinks is you wouldn't be surprised if the theatrics, the magnitude of that location might add to him an extra something. But of course, Trump has said publicly that they could even have gone back to Alaska, where Dan was the other day, to try and do this again. Now, one of the advantages there is, you've gone through the security checks. It's on a US air base. It would essentially logistically be about just recreating it. But this is the next bit now. And Trump is going to get on the phone to Putin and he's going to ask him about that meeting. Now, as Dan said, Putin's aim was to set the trap for Zelensky, to portray him as the saboteur, him and the Europeans as the potential saboteurs. Here was Putin willing to do a deal, willing to have peace, and it was those pesky Europeans who stood in the way. I think part of the skill of this delegation that we've been watching over the last few hours was they quite subtly, and with an approach that was entirely focused on knowledge and understanding of the way President Trump thinks, they managed to shift the discussion to a place where they really framed Putin as the potential saboteur. So, given that, as one diplomatic source told us this morning, the key thing is who was the last voice who Trump listened to, and this was a European official who was saying, we need to make sure we are the last voice. And you could see that played out in the room. And now if Trump gets on the phone to Putin and Putin says no trilateral or bilateral meeting, not interested, then that may well change the course of the conversation.
Do you think
going
he
forward.
speaks to Putin tonight?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, he indicated that he would attempt to. And look, if Putin doesn't answer, then that would not be in keeping of the sort of approach that he's tried to take to this conversation since Friday night, where he is, and in the Russian media as well, state TV, trying to frame this as a sort of emerging alliance.
Okay, Dan, let's just, cut to the key points now. I guess a lot of people listening to this will kind of say, okay, President Trump seems to have opened up something interesting and who knows, potentially remarkable here. We all know he wants to be seen as a peacemaker. He said that many times. He wants a Nobel Peace Prize. Nothing wrong with wanting that, for lots of reasons, many of them good. So, but I guess the key question is, we know that's what President Trump wants, and he has a lot of power to, exert pressure, make it possible. But if they don't meet in the middle, it can't happen, to state the obvious. So let's just talk through the various elements, if you don't mind. Can we start with the security guarantees? Because this has been so much debated, and the Europeans have worked so hard on it. But where do you think we realistically are? Obviously, President Trump has moved quite a lot on it, but what kind of security guarantee do you think we're talking about? How reliable is it? And do we think that the Americans are, basically reliable when they give a security guarantee these days?
Well, I think I can put this in the words of someone I was speaking to this morning when I asked that kind of question. What do these security guarantees mean in practice? And essentially, they said the message to the Russians would be, if you interfere with the peacekeepers or Ukraine afterwards, we will drop something big and nasty on you, to the Russians. So that's the kind of framing of it. Now, how is it different from being in NATO? Well, it kind of isn't really. It's a semantic point, I think, to perhaps enable the Russians to save face, to say, look, they've kept Ukraine out of NATO, and that's something that they can go back to their domestic audience with. But effectively, it amounts to almost the same thing. NATO-like security guarantees mean that if Russia breaks any agreement that's made or in any way tries to attack troops on the ground, that would trigger an automatic response, and Russia would know about that and be aware of that and would have to take that conscious decision to effectively start a wider war with the rest of Europe that has American backing. So I think that's the idea around it, is it's sort of NATO without being in NATO, but it gives you that critical Article 5 backing, which is an attack on any of the forces patrolling Ukraine, including Ukrainian forces, would effectively trigger an automatic response as a deterrence. That's the idea. And what I think has shifted is that President Putin in Alaska said that he was willing to accept that. Not that Ukraine would be in NATO, but he was willing to accept a NATO-style guarantee. And that is a shift. But as I say, then we move on to the other issue, which you might want to pick up on, which is then we get into, okay, well, park that, then let's talk territory.
Okay, but before we do that, do you think that European leaders and President Zelensky believe Donald Trump has, let's be honest, blown hot and cold even about NATO. Now, his supporters would say, well, he was, trying to push NATO into actually pulling its finger out and, taking care of some of the expenditure of its European nation's own defence, and that was a perfectly reasonable position. And look, he's achieved pretty good results. And I think there's a lot to be said for that argument, whatever you think of President Trump. But fundamentally, he has blown hot and cold about NATO. Do President Zelensky and European leaders believe him when he says that he might be willing to go in for a meaningful security guarantee?
Well, I think they have to at the moment. It's the only sort of game in town, if you like. They need that American backing in terms of intelligence, in terms of armaments. Donald Trump's been very clear there wouldn't be American boots on the ground, but there would be an awful lot of logistical backing. I suppose where it is subtly different is it's not enshrined in a formal sort of NATO membership, and so maybe there's a bit more wiggle room, a bit more kind of area of fudge, where if there is some sort of conflagration, some sort of attack by Russia that involves Ukraine, that there's a bit more space to sort of say, well, let's talk about it, let's not trigger all-out war. Whereas I think that the NATO sort of cast iron Article 5 guarantee maybe would be more black and white. But who knows? I mean, you're right. Donald Trump has blown hot and cold. He's going to be in office for a couple more years, and then who knows will take over if they will decide to stick with what is agreed, or say actually we're ripping that up. We're not going to underwrite a security guarantee for Ukraine.
Okay, let's talk with both of you. Rohit, you first, about what the final parts of a deal. Let's assume that President Zelensky gets some kind of security guarantee, and Ukraine was supposed to get security guarantees for giving up its nuclear weapons. But anyway, let's leave that to one side for a moment. So they've got every reason not to believe security guarantees. But let's suppose they get a security guarantee and they're reasonably convinced that it's meaningful. Then it comes down probably to territory. Mm-hmm. So let's just interrogate that for a bit. Nobody goes into a negotiation, giving their final position, do they? They go in saying, I want this. What do you think? Putin has said he wants the whole of these contested regions, which he doesn't certainly control all of Donetsk yet, of the Donbass yet. So let's. What do you think fundamentally is his bottom line, and what do you fundamentally think is Zelensky's bottom line?
Well, Putin wants Donbass.
But does he really think he's going to get it all, or is he privately saying, I'm not going to get the bits I don't currently control, but if I get everything I do currently control, then maybe that's enough? I mean, that doesn't feel like him.
I struggle to see how he can try and sell that to Russian people, having made it such a red line up until this point. And if you think that's implausible, well, perhaps the reason is because he doesn't see a resolution here. That actually, and this is what a lot of people think who are in some of those governments who were represented at the White House earlier, there is a sense that actually for him, all of this is a delaying tactic. That, these European leaders can sit around the table and fawn over Trump and talk about how more has been achieved in the last 2 weeks than has been in the last 3.5 years. But what is less clear is actually whether Vladimir Putin really sees a territorial end to this war as being anything less, potentially less than that. And it's fair to say that the sort of normal rules that apply to a negotiation like this, actually in this case, don't apply to not one, but two of the key players, Presidents Trump and Putin. And so, what was interesting today was, we've all been talking about the question of ceding territory. That's formed such a part of the build-up to this meeting. And yet it was actually such a small part of the discussions today. I just saw a moment just now from Zelensky's remarks in the White House, sitting next to some of his European sort of allies / advisors / bodyguard leaders, and he kind of batted it away. He said that territorial issues need to be discussed at a leader-to-leader level, which feels like a fair thing to say. And he's obviously opening himself up to the idea of having a discussion. But, and ordinarily you'd be saying, yes, these both sides make an agreement beforehand, then they go into the room and just sign it. But I think here, Zelensky has strategically put that question off successfully today. He didn't dominate the conversation. And his approach now is to try and get that bilateral or trilateral and then talk about it then.
Dan, like Rohit, you've reported many times from the front line in Ukraine. You know the territory intimately. You've seen it battled over. What is your own personal assessment of what the two leaders, and I mean Zelensky and Putin here, what their bottom line territory deal negotiating positions really would be?
I'd be really surprised if Volodymyr Zelensky was willing to give up towns like Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, which are in the Donetsk region currently under Ukrainian, the bit that's under Ukrainian control, because they are effectively their sort of fortresses which stand in the way of Russia and miles, hundreds of miles of just sort of open rolling agricultural land. And they are kind of, military headquarters for the Ukrainians there. That would be a very bitter pill for him to swallow and for his military generals to accept. So I suspect that might not be acceptable to him. He might be willing to see some extra territory in Donetsk, but those towns I think would be difficult. I suppose on the other hand, it depends also what is on the table in terms of what Putin is willing to give back in Zaporizhia or Kherson. So, but I think there is a strategic reason why that is a very difficult red line for him to surrender in Donetsk, because it would leave them open in a few years' time for Russian tanks to just sort of stream into the heartland of Ukraine. And I think they as you mentioned, they've had security guarantees before, and Putin has ignored them. So I think this is, we're going to get down to the real nitty-gritty very soon, but those areas I think will be tough.
Dan, thank you very much. Rohit, last word very quickly to you, just on the question of whether in the Donetsk area that Ukraine currently controls, whether there is if it comes down to that and both sides have to walk away saying they've got a good deal, is it plausible in your sense, you've been there, the territory, that there is some kind of deal where Zelensky keeps some of it, but he gives this bit, and there's a bit of horse trading on different bits of territory where everyone can say they've got a good deal from where they stand now, or you just don't see that's possible?
Well, it's possible. In fact, I'm looking at a map here. It's a picture I've just been sent, which was taken in the Oval Office, and it's Zelensky showing Trump a map of Ukraine, and it's got those territories. Donetsk, 76% occupied by Russia. Look, I mean, it's possible that the scenario discussed next is a freezing of the front line. And that's a big difference from the idea of ceding territory. Like, it's all ceding territory for Ukraine. It's all Ukrainian territory. I do think, however, that with those security guarantees, and look, there's domestic political pressure on Zelensky that wasn't there a few months ago, certainly wasn't there at the start of this war. It is possible that the starting point for those negotiations may well be the freezing of the front line.
Okay, fascinating chat. That's all we've got time for. Thanks for listening or watching. We'll have much more coverage on the fallout from today on the ITV News YouTube channel, the news section of ITVX, and the ITV News website. And of course, we'll be back soon with another episode. Until then, goodbye.